We are now on the top of Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, but we have to add something to our discussion earlier. Allow me to add that this Gemara seems to maintain that if you do one action, you can generate multiple violations of malachos. The Aruch HaNer says, no, this is not one action. First he lit the fire, and then he put the pot on the fire. So the malach of Havara he violated when he lit the fire. And the malach of Bishul he violated when he put the pot on the fire. Other Rishonim say that, no, you don't understand. What happened was there was a pot on the fire. There was a pot on the grates. What's it called? The cooktop, whatever you call it. And then he lit the fire. In which case there was only one pu'ula, and he violated both Havara, lighting a fire, and cooking simultaneously with one Maisa. So the Rishonim say that then this Gemara that we're learning, this Beitza, reflects the Shita that Yesh Chiluk Malachas Liyantif, which means that just like on Shabbos, if you do one action that involves multiple malachas, for example, the Gemara has a case where you violate both Meleches Ktsira and Meleches Zeriya, or that's actually called Notea, with one action that's called pruning. Everybody know what pruning is? You remember those fancy houses that have bushes on the outside? Yeah, I'm thinking of one house next to my sister's house, Manhattan Beach. I mean, there are bushes that go up all the way, very high, and there are always gardens there, pruning it. So pruning could be Meleches Ktsira. If after you prune it, you take the branches and you use it for firewood. And it's also a malach called Notea because it aids in the process of growth. In any event, the same thing applies to Yontif, according to Tosafos' interpretation of our Gemara here on the top of Yud Beis Amud Beis. And therefore, even if he put the pot onto the grates and then subsequently turned on the fire, when he turns on the fire, he's chayav two sets of malchus, one for Mavir and one for Mavasha. But the Gemara rejects this. Amalei, Rabbi Yochanan said to that Chacham who brought this Beitza to his attention, Hook, go out, Sni, and learn the Beitza Libra outside the Beis Medrash. Don't bring this Beitza into the Beis Medrash. It's not a reliable Beitza because the Beitza calculates 5 malchus, and in fact there are only 4. Why? Havara ubishul eno mishnah. There's no Beis Medrash that could ever accept that you can be chayav 2 malachos for one action, and you can generate a chiyuv of both mavir and mavashil with one action. In other words, our shita, says Rabbi Yochanan, is ein chiluk malachas le-yontif. There may be chiluk malachas le-Shabbos, and for one act of zomer, you can be chayav for both notea and kotzer, but on yontif, for one act of turning on a fire, you cannot be chayav for both havara and mavasha. The imtim tzalover mishnah, and if somehow you want to defend this Beitza as if it was a reliable tradition, then Beis Shammai, you can only explain this Beitza if you hold like Beit Shammai. The Amri, because they hold lo Amrina mitoch chukta l'tzorach hutranami shelo l'tzorach. They never accepted the principle of mitoch. And therefore, Hachanami applying that principle of Beit Shammai here, lo amrina mitoch shehuvara havara l'tzorach hutranami shelo l'tzorach. And therefore, you need that the malach be l'tzorach ochel nefesh according to Beit Shammai, and this havara is not l'tzorach ochel nefesh because what's he cooking? Gid anoshe, and to boot gid anoshe b'cholah, which is basa b'cholah. That's not ochel nefesh. So therefore, Beit Shammai say that he gets malchus for violating avara, and malchus for violating mavashal. These are 2 malachas on yontif. However, the Beis Hillel, if you're going to attribute this Beitza to Beis Hillel, you're in trouble. Why? Because Beis Hillel are of the opinion that came in the Amri. They hold mitov shehutzul l'tzorech, or in the case of hotzah l'tzorech, hutzah nami shelo l'tzorech. And that's not a specific halacha mitoch as it applies to hotzah exclusively, but rather applies to every single malach, the nature of which is ochel nefesh. Hachanami there too. Mitoch shehutra havara litzorech, meaning normally you light a fire in order to cook on the fire. Hutra nami shelo litzorech, even though you're not going to eat from that foodstuff that you cook on that fire because it's kiranosha b'chola. Nevertheless, the Torah permits it. And there's no way, no how that according to Beis Hill, who accept mitov, you can get malchus for hotzah, for havara, or for that matter, for bishul. That means you're going to drop two of the malchus down from 5 down to 3. And that's Rabbi Yochanan Shita, according to which Beis Hill will accept the principle of mitov. It applies not only to hotzah, which by nature is a meleches of nefesh, it applies to bishul, it applies to havara. These malachas, by their very nature, are malachas of nefesh. And the Torah says that you're allowed to do these malachas as long as you have some tzarech for it. And here you have some tzarech for it. Now, Rashi's shita here in mitoch is a lot easier and smoother than Tosaf's shita. Because Rashi also, when you apply mitoch, the malach is completely muteres legamre. And therefore, even though he's cooking giranoshe with chalav, nonetheless, it doesn't matter. The Torah never prohibited bishul or havara on yantiv because these are malachas of ochel nefesh. That's the sheet of Rashi. Tosas, on the other hand, is going to say that you don't get malchus in this case because you have some sort of itzorah. Again, it's a little bit difficult in the framework of Tosas to justify this itzorah here. What kind of itzorah is there? The Torah doesn't allow you to eat this cooked food. But perhaps we could say that according to Tosas, maybe what the Gemara means to say is that even if it was shalol litzarach klal and it's prohibited, but it would not come under a chiyuv malchus. And this touches on a whole different sugya. If we were learning Masechet Makis, is there such a thing as a lav d'oraisa without malchus? And this leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis. Now, to introduce this Mishnah, we need a lot of background material. And, yesterday I gave a tshuva drasha here, Shabbos Shuva. So my whole afternoon, I was busy trying to collect my thoughts. And after Yom Tov, after Shabbos, we have what we call in our family Yitzias Mitzrayim, which means that we have to pack up all the food and all our clothes and go back to Har Nof. And then I had to figure out my car didn't work. I've had to get back from Har Nof to Katamon. So the Gemara that we're about to learn really requires hours and hours of preparation. But we're going to try to do the best we can with the tools we have. So after all those apologetics, now let's get to work. There's a fundamental difference between truma on the one hand and matnas kahuna on the other hand. Meaning, although truma is one of 24 matnas kahuna, nevertheless, truma has a chumrah, a certain stringency that doesn't apply with regard to other matnas kahuna. Now, when I say other matnas kahuna, what we have to figure in our minds are the following. Challah, you have a dough and you have to mafresh challah and give it to the Kohen. And what's called zroa l'chayayim v'keva. These are parts of the animal that after shechita, you have to give to the Kohen. Whole question about why this doesn't apply in our day. No one gives zroa l'chayayim v'keva to the Kohen, but in the Doraisa level, that's what we have to do. Now, here's the difference. The Torah allowed you to be mafresh truma on Yontif and on Shabbos. There's no malacha per se that you violated, but the Rabbanan prohibited. And the Rabbanan said that afrashas truma is tikkun mana. What does that mean? It's like makav patish. Makav patish, which is one of the 39 malachas, means that you fix something up. Like the hammer gets a little dull after the blacksmith used it over and over again. So the last bang he gives on the anvil smooths out the hammer so that he can use it next time. So that's makav patish. anytime you complete something and perfect it, that comes under Makav Patish. In the case of Tevel, which is prohibited to a non-Kohen, the tikkun is to be mafresh truma. That's called haramas truma. Literally, you lift truma. You pick it up, you set it aside, and then the rest, the balance of the food, is chulin, and now you're allowed to eat it. So the Rabbanan prohibited hafrashas truma on Yontif, on Shabbos and on Yontif. However, in the case of challah, it's an entirely different story. Why? Because if you prepare bread on Yontif, which the Torah allows you to do, so then you take flour, you add the water, you do what's called gilgul, which means kneading with a K, kneading the dough, and then you bake it. And now, if you're going to allow me to bake my bread on Yontif, you have to allow me to be mafresh challah, because, I have a problem with challah. Or let's take, for example, the case of Zrola Chayayim V'Keva. There, the Torah will allow you, and even the Rabbanan will allow you to separate the Zrola Chayayim V'Keva from the B'Shachtin animal, simply because you're not doing any tikkun. What does that mean? You're allowed to eat from the animal even without setting aside the Zrola Chayayim V'Keva. If you were to take the flesh of the animal, you could cook it and you could eat it. So there's no tikkun mana here. You didn't really perfect anything because matnas kahuna enam tovlos. There's no teva. And the Easter of Hafrasha applies as a tikkun mana when there's a tevel. Tevel means the status before Hafrasha. Now you mafresh it and you matir the tevel. Now, the other introduction that we need here is what's called holacha. Holacha means that after I set aside the truma, for example, I have to bring it to the Kohen. That's the mitzvah of nesina l'Kohen. So Chazal were very worried that if we're going to allow you to bring the truma to the Kohen, maybe you'll come to be mafresh the truma. So they prohibited the whole package deal. We're not going to allow you, neither on Shabbos nor on Yontif, not A and not B. We're not going to allow you to be mafresh truma. We're not going to allow you to be molech truma, to bring the truma to the Kohen. However, when it comes to challah or other matnas kahuna where there's no iser hafrasha, then with the Rabbanan allow for the entire package deal, they'll allow you A, to be mafresh, and B, to be molech. And that's going to be the subject of our Beis Shammai Omrim, ein molichin challah umatonis l'kohen b'yontif. If we're going to allow you to be mafresh challah on yontif, we'll allow you to be mafresh zrol l'chayayim v'kev, but not to bring it to the Kohen. Because in that sense, we're going to, even though, again, technically, what are you afraid of? If you bring it to the Kohen, he might be mafresh. He's allowed to be mafresh. So it's not like truma. But nevertheless, we're going to make a similarity between truma as the paradigm case of matnas kuna and all the other matnas kuna. Just like truma is prohibited in holacha l'kohen, so too challah and zrola chayayim v'keva are prohibited in holacha l'kohen. And Beit Shammai spell it out. Bein shehur mumei emesh. Whether or not he did the hafrasha yesterday on Erev Yom, Bein shehur mumei hayom, or if he was mafresh today on Yontif, even though the Chacham allow you to be mafresh challah and other matnas kun on Yontif, but nevertheless to bring it to the Kohen is prohibited. And he writes here in the note, the Trumas of Maisus bilvad masha asru Chacham es hafrashasam b'Yontif asru gam holachasam l'Kohen. So if we're going to use Truma as a paradigm, there's a double Easter regarding Truma. Number one, Hafrasha, number two, Holacha. And that becomes paradigmic according to Beit Shammai for all other matnas kuna. We might allow you to be mafresh, but we're not going to allow you to be molech. Beis Hillel matirim, Beis Hillel allow you not only Hafrasha, but also Holacha. Amru lehem Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai turned to Beis Hillel, and they open up their counter argument to Beis Hillel with the words Zera Shava. You have to be very careful. We're not really talking about Zera Shava. Gzeira Shava means that just like we have in the Torah comparisons and analogies called Gzeira Shava, so too, when we deal with rabbinic prohibitions, we should be making Gzeira Shava. We should be making equations and analogies. And what is the argument and the logic of Beis Shammai? Chala umatanos. What's common to both chala and zrola chayim v'keva? Matana l'kohen. These are gifts that are given to the kohen. Truma, matana l'kohen. So truma becomes your paradigm. Kishem shein molichin es truma. You're not allowed to be molech truma to the kohen. Now keep in mind, you're not allowed to be mafresh truma to the kohen. But he was mafresh the truma on Erev Yontif, and now on Yontif he wants to be molech the truma to the kohen. He's not allowed to do so because we're afraid, as we said earlier, that if we allow him to do the halacha of truma, then he might come to do the afrasha of truma. And here, Beis Shammai argued, Basil, you don't disagree with me that halachas truma lekohen is prohibited on Yontif. Is kach? Let's derive by equation she'ein molichin es hamatonos. Even if you have mafresh the matonos on Erev Yontif, right? Because keep in mind, Beit Shammai said bein shehumu emesh is Erev Yontif. Even so, we're not going to allow you halach on Yontif. Ach ein molichin es hamatonos. Even if the afrasha took place on Erev Yontif, Amalem Beis Hillel. Lo im amartem, there's a fundamental difference. Betruma she'eni zakai baramasa. You're not allowed to be mafresh truma on Yontif, and therefore you're not allowed to be molech truma on Yontif because it's a package deal. Tomru, you derive conclusions b'matanos with regard to other matnas. Zakai baramasa. You're allowed to be mafresh kala on Yontif. You're allowed to be mafresh zrol chayim v'kev b'Yontif. And therefore, if we're allowing you to do that frasha, we'll allow you to do the halacha. The Gemara says, at this point, the Gemara thinks, with regard to the language of Mei Hayom, you see that Beit Shammai say, Bein Shehurmu Mei Emesh, Bein Shehurmu Mei Hayom. And what do we learn from the word Mei Hayom? Shehurmu Mei Hayom, that the hafrasha was done today, and in the case of the behemoth, with regard to Zolach Hayim, he did the shchita on Yontif itself. And even though he did the shchita and the harama of chala on Yontif itself, nevertheless, Beis Shammai prohibit holacha. And when it says hurmu shehurmu me emesh v'shishtu me emesh, then it means that Beit Shammai prohibit holacha on Yontif, even with regard to matanos that was shechted on Yontif, because me emesh means erev Yontif, so hayom means on Yontif. So you went ahead and you shechted an animal on Yontif, which you're allowed to do, or you did lisha to prepare your dough on Yontif, and then you were mafresh challah, which you're allowed to do. And even so, halacha is prohibited. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, allow you to do the halacha of Yontif, even with regard to matanos that were hurmu on Erev Yontif. So the Gemara says, Mani Masnisen, who could possibly fit into the Mishnah's description of the Machlokes Shem Beis Hillel Beit Shammai? Lo Rabbi Yossi, lo Rabbi Yehuda, Ella Acherim. We're going to have a threefold Machlokas in the Brisa that we're about to quote between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Acherim on the anonymous Tanoim, about how to interpret our Mishnah, the Machlokes Shem Beis Hillel Beit Shammai, with regard to halacha. And this three-way Machlokes is going to work out in a way that only one of those three opinions, that of the Acherim and Shtim, can be reconciled with our Mishnah. So now we want to learn this three-way Machlokes. This Sanya we learned in the Brisa. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Lo nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel al hamatanos. And again, when it says matanos, we're talking about challah. Shehurmu may Erev Yontiv. If he did the afresh on Erev Yontiv, Ishem Olichim, he certainly would allow, and even Beit Shammai would permit, bringing on Yontif to the Kohen, Im Hamatono Shehurmu me'ayom v'shenishchetu me'ayom. So if you started baking your bread, you were mafresh challah today on Yontif, everything took place on Yontif, and you shechted an animal on Yontif, then certainly you could be molech on Yontif. Now you have truma, you have challah that you were mafresh on Erev Yontif. Once you're already bringing to the Kohen the matonos shehurmu b'Yontif, then, and he say, take a tram. You know what I mean? Let the matonis that he separated on Erev Yontif go on the same carriage, so to speak. Lo nechleku, what is the battlefield of this machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai? Ela lo nechleku ela leholichon v'fnei atzmon. So we're talking about harama of truma, of matonos, of challah, of yesterday, of Erev Yontif. And now Beit Shammai get very nervous. Why? Because now b'fnei atzmon, you want to be molech on Yontif, that which was prepared, or you could have been molech on Erev Yontif. It's like, why'd you wait till Yontif? You should have done it on Erev Yontif. Beit Shammai omer ein molech. If you're already being molech, that which you prepared on Yontif, you did the shechita on Yontif, you did the harama of challah on Yontif, and you're allowed to be molech, then Beit Shammai say, we'll let you take a trem. But b'fnei atzmon, we're going to tell you you're not allowed to do that because you took the shechita or the harama was on Erev Yontif. U'Beis Hillel omer molichin, even b'fnei atzmon. V'kacha Beit Shammai donim. And now let's analyze the logic of Beit Shammai. Chala u'matonos, matana l'kohen. Truma, matana l'kohen. Kishen she molichin es ha-truma, kach ein molichin es ha-matanos. Again, we're talking about matanos shehurmu me erev yontif. And there's no reason in the world why you should delay holacha till yontif. You should have done the holacha yesterday on erev yontif, because that's when you shechted the animal. That's when you were mafresh challah. Don't wait till today. Do till tomorrow. Do today what you could have done. I mean, don't postpone till tomorrow what you could have done today. And that's a general rule in Yontif, that we want you to do all the preparations on Erev Yontif. So be molech to the Kohen. You've got aroma, be molech the matana to the Kohen on Erev Yontif. Don't delay it till Yontif. We already saw that on Truma, we don't allow you Allah on Yontif. Amalem Beis Hillel, lo im amar to be Truma she'eno zakoi baramasa. You're not allowed to be mafresh Truma on Yontif, and therefore, for sure, you're not allowed to be molech Truma on Yontif, because we're afraid if we allow Allah, you'll come to be mafresh Truma on Yontif. Omar, what does that have to do with our case of Matono Shezakoi Baramasa, that you're allowed to be mafresh on Yontif? And therefore, if the halacha permits you to be mafresh on Yontif, the halacha should permit you to be molech on Yontif. And you'll tell me, well, how can we allow halacha? You might come to Afroch, but you're allowed to be mafresh on Yontif. Amar Rabbi Yossi, now we go on to the second presentation of the machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, that of Rabbi Yossi. Lo nechleku Beit Shammai Beis Hillel al matanos shemolichin. There was never an issue about halacha. Beit Shammai allow you to be molech matanos to the Kohen, and it doesn't matter whether or not you were mafresh them erev yontif or on yontif. It doesn't matter whether you shechted the animal on erev yontif or on yontif. Lo nechleku ela al hatruma. Interesting. According to Rabbi Yossi, Beis Hillel allow halacha even in truma. Shebeit Shammai omei molichin and Beis Hillel omei molichin. Now let's see if we can understand the logic of this machlok. Kacha Beis Hillel done. Now in the transmission of Rabbi Yossi, it was Beis Hillel who had to prove. The ball was in their court to prove, and the burden of proof is on their shoulders to prove that you're allowed to be molich on yontif truma to the Kohen. And now challah is going to become the paradigm. Challah umatonos, matona lekoe, truma, matona lekoe. And now we're going to use Xer Shalom. Kishem shemolichnes matanos to a Kohen on Yontif. Kach molichnes at truma. Amalahem Beit Shammai loim amartem. Now Beit Shammai, the ball is in their court to reject the logic and the analogy of this. Loim amartem matanos shezakoi baramos. The Torah allowed you to be mafresh, that therefore hence you're allowed to be molech. Omru, you cannot derive any conclusion about truma. Shein zakoi baramos. The Torah with the Xer the Rabbanan prohibited Afrosha's truma. And if Afrosha's truma is also, then even Alocha's truma is also. And honestly speaking, amongst friends, I can tell you that according to Rabbi Yossi, I personally would vote for Beit Shammai. The logic of Beit Shammai is very compelling. But now we get to the third transmission of the Machlokes. It's still Beit Shammai, and that's about Chirim Omrim. Lo nechagu Beit Shammai Beis Hillel ala truma. Everybody agrees, even Beis Hillel. She'en molichim. You're not allowed to be molech truma to a kohen on Yom. It means that yesterday on Erev Yom Tov was mafresh truma. Today on Yom Tov he wants to be molech. It's prohibited, even according to Beis Hillel. Lo nechlaku ela al matonos holochas matonos. Shebeit Shammai omrim ein molichim. And this really seems to be a reflection of our Mishnah. The Acherim are saying that Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai have machlokas here with regard to matanos, whether it's behema, whether it's challah, and the shechita took place on Yontif, or even if the shechita took place before Yontif. In both cases, Beit Shammai say that we don't allow holacha. Beis Hillel say that we permit holacha. And the Gemara now is of the opinion that in our Mishnah, we're talking about the case of Matanos of Behema when the Shechita took place on Yontif. And even in that case, where the Shechita took place on Yontif, Beis Hillel prohibited because they have an absolute rule that knows no exception, Ein Molichim Matanos L'Kohen B'Yontif, which is exactly what we see here in Acherim. So our Mishnah must reflect the transmission of the Acherim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Beis Shammai agree that Matono Shehurmu B'Yontif Molichno Solukot. It's only Matono Shehurmu B'Erev Yontif. According to Rabbi Yossi, it's impossible to explain that Mishnah because according to Rabbi Yossi, there was never a machlokes about holochas matanos, and even Beit Shammai permit holochas matanos l'kohen. They only argued about holochas truma. So lema, should we now therefore conclude that acherim he v'lo Rabbi Yehuda? Again, Rabbi Yossi is out of the question. There's no way, no how that we can reconcile that issue with Rabbi Yossi. But the Gemara is vacillating now. Do we have a clear-cut indication from the Mishnah that we have to reject Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of the machlokes? Rava says no. I'm going to present a diuk in the Mishnah, and the conclusion of that diuk is that Adarabah, we're going to assume our Mishnah and the machlokes therein like Rabbi Yehuda. And what's my diuk? Mi Ketani, does it say in our Mishnah, Shehurmu me hayom, Vishenishkatu me hayom, meaning that the shechita was today on Yontif. And that's going to be the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. All it says is Shehurmu Ketani. It doesn't say me hayom. And therefore, the Olam, the way Rava reads our Mishnah, Shitosame Emesh. You could have been Merim your Matanos yesterday before Yontif, because when it says Hurmu, it doesn't mean Hurmu Me'ayom on Yontif, it means Hurmu yesterday. So why weren't you Molech these matanos yesterday. That's the argument of Beit Shammai. So now he delays Haromas Trumas and Mises from Erev Yontif to Yontif. So Beit Shammai say that you're not allowed to be molech them on Yontif. But if there were matanos of a behemoth that was shechted on Yontif itself, or challah that was separated on Yontif itself, and there was no possibility of taking care of this on Erev Yontif, so Beit Shammai would agree that the Chachamim never made a gzera over here. You're allowed to be molech to the Kohen on Yontif, that which you prepared on Yontif. And that's exactly what Rabbi Yehuda said. So now the Gemara says, if you accept Rava's reading of the Mishnah, is lema, should we assume Rabbi Yehuda v'lo acherim? Do we have to now accept our Mishnah, the interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda? Because now Rava has convinced us that in Pashtus, the Machlokes Beisil Beit Shammai apply both to matanos of Behema Shenishchata Kodem Yontif or Yontif. The Gemara answers no. Afilu Tema Acherim, we could reconcile our Mishnah with Acherim Ubahanach Denishchatu Me'emesh. So now if you're going to say Nishchatu Me'emesh, that's exactly Rabbi Yehuda. So what's the difference between Acherim and Rabbi Yehuda? Ihochi Hainu Rabbi Yehuda. Gemara says, Ika Beinayu Tfeila. What happens in a case where you're already been being molech, that which was shechted on Yontif, can we take a tramp, as we said before? Rabbi Yehuda and the Acherim argue about matanos, that the halacha was prohibited. Are you allowed to join them together with matanos where the halacha itself is muteres and bring them all with one halacha to the Kohen? Rabbi Yehuda holds that lo asu Beit Shammai only b'fnei atzma, but you're allowed to be molech the matanos together with that which was shechted on Yontif itself. And here's where the Acherim disagree, and they hold that according to Beit Shammai, you're not allowed to be molech matanos shehurma me'emesh, even if you want to link them together with matanos that were hufreshu hayom. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel halacha ki Rabbi Yossi. We're going to accept halacha Rabbi Yossi that Beit Shammai Beisil only argue about halachas truma. And Rav Tuvi Brei, the Rav Nechemia Havilei Arba the Chamra the truma. They had a chavetz, a barrel full of wine of truma, because Yechayv Midoraisa in Hafrashas Truma Maisus and wine. Also, Lekami the Rabbi Yosef, it was Yontif. Amalei, and they asked, Ma'olam Tuye Lekoin Oidna. Can we bring this chavis of yayin of truma to the Kohen on Yontif? Amalei, Hachi Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel, Alochik Rabbi Yossi. And therefore, the machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai is about halachas truma. We pass like Beis Hillel, and you can be molech truma. Now the Gemara tells the story about Ushbezichne de Rava bar Rav Chanan Havile Isroisa de Chardala. In Hebrew, these are called Chavilos Shuros Shel Chardal. Now, Chardal in its natural state, mustard seeds, you have to separate the seeds from what's called the sharvit, the outer kernel. And are you allowed to do that separation on Yontif? Omalei, he asked the Ma'ul Lefruche Umechel Minaya B'Yontif, can I break the sharvit in such a way that I remove the seeds? And that's a told of Meleches Dash, because Disha means whenever you break something in order to separate one part from the other, the part that you want from the part that you don't want. Is that allowed on Yontif because it's L'tzorech Ochel Nefesh? Or Havi B'Yodi Rava didn't know any. And so Asla Kami the Rava, this is a different Rava, or some have a Girsa Rava, Amalei, you know what he answered him? Molin Molios, you're allowed to do it in a way that's unusual, Kalachar Ya, which is called Molin Molios. You actually just simply take the kernels in your hand and you how do you describe this in English? You swap them with your hands, and mafrichin Kitnios beyond. So this is called Disha Kilachar Yad with a Shinui, and that they allowed on Yontif. We'll have, later on, we're going to have something about mashing bananas. And if you do it on the back of a spoon with a Shinui, they allow it in Tzorchel Nefesh on Yontif. Esvei Abaye has to find Kashma Brisa, Molel Malilos Merev Shabbos. It seems that the Brisa only allows you to do the Malila on Erev Yontif in order to separate the garin, the seed, from the motes, from the chaff. And therefore, the machar menapeach miyad liyad. Once you've already done the melila on Erev Shabbos, then you could just blow it, and you separate the garinim from the chaff. The ochel, you're allowed to do it. Aval lo b'kanon, you're not allowed to use a special kli. And now he has a list of various kelim that are used to separate one from the other. Kanon is a kli sharosho echad rachav. It's very wide on one side. Vasheni tsar. It's narrow on the other side. I think we would call it in English a funnel, if I'm not mistaken. And you pour the kitnios inside the wide side, and you shake it up so that the garinim, which are smaller, will come out on the bottom. Lo b'tamchui. Tamchui is a certain large kind of plate or platter that they used to put the kitnios in. And we used to see this, one of our Sephardic neighbors used to do this with rice, to make sure that there were no, kernels of grains on rice, because they eat rice on Pesach. And you put it, but that you're not allowed to do. And then it says, Hamola Malilos Merev Yontif, L'mocha Menapeach Al Yad V'ocha. V'afilu B'kanon, V'afilu B'tamchu, V'lo B'tavla, V'lo B'nafra, V'lo B'kvara. So in any event, the Brisa clearly indicates that the Malila has to take place on Erev Yontif. In the case of Erev Yontif, once you did the Malila on Erev Yontif, then we're going to allow you not only to blow it and separate the chaff from the garin through Menapeach, through Nipuk, we even allow you to use those kalim that we mentioned before, as long as you don't use a keli that is exclusively dedicated to the Malach of Dash. And we have also kalim that are dedicated and singularly dedicated to Melechas Borer, like a Kvara, which is called a sieve in English. But in any event, all this Malila has to take place on Erev Yontif. That's allowed. But B'Yontif lo, and you just said that you're allowed to do the Malila on Yontif, Afilu Teva B'Yontif, even if you'll tell me that you're allowed to be Mola B'Yontif, says Rava. The reason why the Brisa mentions the Malila on Erev Yontif is because the case of Shabbos, Aydi the Tani B'Reisha. In the case of Shabbos, it's got to be Erev Shabbos, Tani Seifa, May Erev Shabbos. Okay, then, so this is where we're going to stop for today. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. We're up to in Kain Matzinu. Where is that? 2 lines up before the end of the Thank you so much.